Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 85. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 48 and 49 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the effects of anger and of habits in general as to their substance. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether anger causes pleasure. In a word from St. Thomas, as soon as vengeance is present, pleasure ensues, and so much the greater, according as the sorrow was greater. And this is the case for 2 reasons. The first is that just as dehydration makes water more pleasurable to us, the greater the sorrow, the more enjoyable will be one's hope of vengeance, which as a passion is anger. And this on account of hope specifically, as we said in episode 81, for anger is a kind of combination of hope and sorrow, and hope, by bringing into the present the good desired, in this case justice, elicits a kind of pleasure, because pleasure is the effect of the present or acquired good, which hope in a way brings into the present. As St. Thomas says, before vengeance is really present, it becomes present to the angry man in 2 ways. In one way by hope, in another way by thinking of it continually. For to everyone that desires a thing, it is pleasant to dwell on the thought of what he desires. Wherefore the imaginings of dreams are pleasant. Accordingly, an angry man takes pleasure in thinking much about vengeance. This pleasure, however, is not perfect, so as to banish sorrow, and consequently anger. Article 2, whether anger above all causes fervor in the heart. For those under the passion of anger, St. Gregory the Great says, the heart that is inflamed with the stings of its own anger beats quick. The body trembles, the tongue stammers, the countenance takes fire, the eyes grow fierce. They that are well known are not recognized. With the mouth indeed he shapes a sound, but the understanding knows not what it says. And most of us could probably say from experience that anger above all, and at least affects our heart rate and a kind of physical preparedness to strive against this present perceived evil which has wounded us. Article 3, whether anger above all hinders the use of reason. Although the acts of the mind, like the mind itself, are not acts of a bodily organ, since the mind, at least in this life, utilizes both the external and internal senses to act optimally, then when the body is disturbed or impaired, so too becomes our use of reason. Think about drunkenness or dementia as examples of that. In this way, anger can hinder reason by disturbing the body. And in the following way, according to St. Thomas, anger above all causes a bodily disturbance in the region of the heart, so much as to affect even the outward members. Consequently, of all the passions, anger is the most manifest obstacle to the judgment of reason. According to Psalm 30, my eye is troubled with wrath. Article 4, whether anger above all causes taciturnity. Taciturnity here, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is meant to mean a kind of silence. Does anger cause muteness in the one angry? St. Thomas writes, the disturbance of anger reaches to the outward members and chiefly to those members which reflect more distinctly the emotions of the heart, such as the eyes, face, and tongue. Consequently, anger may cause such a disturbance that the tongue is altogether deprived of speech, and taciturnity is the result. And with that, we complete our treatment on the passions and now turn to St. Thomas's discussion on habits, which begins with the following introduction. After treating of human acts and passions, we now pass on to the consideration of the principles of human acts, and firstly, of intrinsic principles. The intrinsic principle is power and habit. It remains for us to consider them in general. In the second place, we shall consider virtues and vices and other like habits, which are the principles of human acts. Article 1, whether habit is a quality. When we talk about existing things, whether it be ourselves or something else, the object of our discussion must necessarily fall within one of the following categories: the substance of a thing, like being human, its particular quantities, like being 5 foot tall, its qualities, being wise, being temperate, its action or being acted upon, like running or being sunburned, and lastly, a thing's various relations of time, place, position, etc. Our present article is asking, among the already mentioned categories of being, as we call them, where habits would fall. But first of all, what is a habit? And I would suggest, for the listener's sake, to disregard the common use of the word habit in this context. And from this point moving forward, whenever the term habit is used, exchange it in the mind for the word disposition. Or think of the word habit as to mean something analogous to a religious habit. So when I was a Carthusian monk, my uniform or religious habit was an all-white, ivory-colored cloth robe. That was my habit. It was something on me. Habits or dispositions are things that are on you and I, or part of us, that affect how we are and how we act. Kind of like the knowledge of English is on you. It makes you an English speaker and allows you to speak and to read English. Kind of like the virtue of temperance is on you. If you possess it, it makes you temperate and is the reason why you act temperately. These are examples of qualities or habits which are defined by Aquinas as a disposition whereby that which is disposed well or ill, and this either in regard to itself or in regard to another. Thus, health is a habit. So going back to our examples, the knowledge of English, the virtue of temperance, or physical health, all dispose you well and in a stable way to read English, to not speak too much at the dinner table, or to function well physically. All of these things, health, temperance, and the knowledge of English, are qualities of you. Habits do not constitute your substance. They are not a quantitative aspect of you, an action or a being acted upon, or essentially a kind of relation, and therefore must fall within the only category left, which is the category of quality. Article 2, whether habit is a distinct species of quality. So proceeding methodically in our treatment of habits, the next thing that Aquinas is going to do is to distinguish habits, which we have just shown is a quality, from the other qualities that we have, such as the powers of the soul. Since, as Aquinas said way back in question 77 of the first volume of the Summa, as the power of the soul is not its essence, it belongs to the second species of accident, that of quality. The powers of the soul may be said to be a medium between substance and accident, as being natural properties of the soul. What that means is that faculties are themselves a kind of quality. Powers like the intellect and the will, for example, they are not the substance of man, his soul informing his body, but rather something in that substance. And because they are in us, in our substance, they are what we call an accident. And what Aquinas means by that word is very different than how we use it today. So for more on accidents, see episode 64. And the particular way that powers or faculties are in us is as a quality. But different than the quality of a habit, these powers or faculties are called proper qualities, ones that flow naturally from our substance, in a way that would definitely not be the case in terms of habits with things like the habitual knowledge of English or the habit of temperance, which is why we need a distinction within the qualities which we do have. And habits, as a kind of quality, are distinguished from the others in the following way, according to Aquinas. In habit and disposition, we consider both evil and good, and also changeableness, whether easy or difficult. And so the philosopher defines habit, a disposition whereby someone is disposed well or ill, and he says that by habits we are directed well or ill in reference to the passions. And then distinguishing habit from the notion of disposition in general, Aquinas continues, it is clear that the word habit implies a certain lastingness, while the word disposition does not. So lastly, as a kind of synopsis of what we mean by habit in this context, here is the introduction from the Gilby Summa on habits. If one has a habit to X, then it is easier to X than if one has not. Examples are being generous and speaking French. If one has a habit of Xing, then it is harder not to X than if one has not. Examples are smoking and saying, I say, before each sentence. So I know that was a lot, but habits can be one of the most difficult parts of our anthropology to understand, and we will have much more of the Summa on the topic, but hopefully all of that has been said thus far has been sufficient to give a kind of glimpse into the kind of quality we call habits. And again, if it is a little unclear, no worries, we have an incredible amount of forthcoming articles and questions to continue to discuss it. Article 3, whether habit implies order to an act. Generally speaking, things don't just exist to exist, but for the sake of some particular action. And this because everything tends towards its own perfection, which entails for everything short of God, obtaining that perfection via its own action. And since a habit is a stable disposition, either to good or ill, and since what we mean by good or ill is specifically in reference to some particular action, then habit does imply an order to action. For example, the disposition or quality of English in a man helps is for good the act of reading English or speaking English. And that is good for him because he is a rational animal of which reading and speaking aids his acts of reason. And this stable disposition to some particular category of action is what defines that habitual knowledge of English. So in response to our article, we can say that habit does imply some relation to a particular act. In St. Thomas's words, it is essential to habit to imply some relation to a thing's nature, insofar as it is suitable or unsuitable thereto, but a thing's nature is further ordained to another end, which is either an operation or the product of an operation, and wherefore every habit is subjected or within a power implies principally relation to an act. Article 4, whether habits are necessary, and habits are necessary in order to give a sufficient account for human action. Why did this man eat too many donuts? If we're trying to figure it out, we can't just appeal to his external circumstances because his intellect and will are not determined by physical circumstances. We can't say his action was determined by internal or external directed senses because insofar as his action was voluntary, again, it was not necessarily determined by them, but from the freedom of his intellect and will. So to properly explain the effect, eating too many donuts, we have to appeal to some additional cause or source of determination, something that pins that action down to the particular action that occurred. So to give an adequate account of this man's action or the reason why he did what he did, his powers, whether internally or directed externally, whether spiritual or corporeal, nor his external circumstances, can give an adequate account or reason for that action. Thus, we have to look not just at a man's faculties, his circumstances, but the disposition or quality of those faculties. And that is what it means to inquire into a man's habits, his virtues, and his vices. If we say the man ate too many donuts because he has a habitual vice or disposition, tendency to do so, then along with all the other relevant factors in this action which we have just mentioned, we will now have an adequate explanation for why he did the particular thing that he did, eating too many donuts. As Aquinas says, if the form, so let's say the thing in question, is limited to one fixed operation, no further disposition besides the form itself is needed for the operation. But if the form be such that it can operate in diverse ways, as the soul, it needs to be disposed to its operations by means of habits. And with that, we come to a close of the first of many, many episodes on habits within the Summa. We have just finished covering questions 48 and 49 in the Prima Secundae, that is, of the effects of anger and of habits in general as to their substance. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic. and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.